Basically, in the future on my channel, I want to be able to talk about my style of communism, which is libertarian communism, because I think it's maybe a good idea, a good way to organize production. Richard Wolff debated a libertarian recently at a Libertarian Institute, and it's on YouTube, so I'll put the link in the description. And basically the whole time, the libertarian was like, oh yeah, I don't actually disagree with what you're saying. The whole time, I mean, what Richard Wolff was advocating for was Marxism as it relates to a mode of production. But politically, it was libertarianism. And so the libertarian was just like, oh yeah, I don't disagree with any of that stuff. Jordan Peterson has talked about Marx and Marxism for years and built a career talking about Marxism. And then when he went to debate Slavoj Zizek, Peterson said, well, you know, I thought I would understand Marx, so I'm going to read the Communist Manifesto. Almost as if he hadn't read it before. But actually, if you listen to Marxists like David Harvey, yeah, they don't talk about the Communist Manifesto. So what is Marxism? Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor, I use they, them pronouns, and I talk about the intersection of robotics and society. I wanted to talk today about terminology as it relates to politics, and specifically how it relates to my politics. So in general, I'm going to be talking about something called Libertarian Communism, and also talk about libertarianism in general, as far as what that means in the United States. And we're going to talk about the political compass, the difference between authoritarian and libertarian thinking. So yeah, let's get right into it. So some people hear the term libertarian communist and they think it's a contradiction. A lot of people, when they think of communism, they think of Stalin, you know, gulags, and authoritarianism. However, there have always been people who advocated for something that they called communism, who did not want a government or a state to force people into that lifestyle. Those people were usually the victims of regimes like Stalin. You know, as far back as the 1800s, when a lot of people were talking about this kind of thing, there were people, Peter Kropotkin wrote a book called The Conquest of Bread, and it's the reason why a lot of left YouTubers are also sometimes referred to as BreadTube. Another great author there is Mikhail Bakunin, who wrote also in the 1800s. And these people were alive at the same time as Karl Marx and shared some of his thinking and disagreed in other places. Another great thinker is Errico Malatesta. I would suggest looking at the YouTube channel Anarcopac by Zoe Baker if you actually want to learn about these figures. This is an off-the-cuff video and I don't have a bunch of research and quotes for you, but Zoe Baker Anarcopac is a really excellent channel for learning about these people. So let's talk about the political compass. Many of you have seen this, I'm sure, but I'm putting it on screen now, and you can see here that you have two axes. You have left and right. This is the axes that we normally think of, but there's an additional vertical axis with authoritarianism on the top and libertarianism on the bottom. So if you're a left authoritarian, then you think, you know, maybe communism is great and it's so great you should force everyone to do it and you should, you know, potentially murder people who don't agree with you. So that's what Stalin did. But there are also left libertarians, and these are people who have a left-leaning view of the world, but they just think it's a good idea. They don't want to force anyone to do it. They just want to find like-minded people who are willing to do it voluntarily. And on the right, you have right authoritarianism, and that's fascism, like in Italy. And then you could have right libertarianism. I don't have a good example of that. You know, it's interesting, actually, when you look at this compass, this political compass, it's not obvious exactly what left and right even means in this context, because you know, people associate right with you know, a particular mode of production, the capitalist mode of production, but actually it's I guess it's really about kind of conservative thinking, traditional values and things like that. However, I will say that once things get politicized, like when they hit the big stage and all the media, sometimes the right actually is throwing out traditional values like family in order to further some other goal. And this happens on the left too, where the left say that they, care about the homeless. But I recently saw a spot in San Francisco that said some spot on the side of the freeway that looked like a great place to camp. I had signs that said, "Oh, environmentally sensitive area, no entry." And it seemed like the left in San Francisco was using environmental politics to remove the homeless from an area that otherwise looked like it had actually a safe walkway to it and a nice spot where people could be sleeping. So people on the left will often, especially once it gets into politics dealing with the state and the government, they will sabotage the real left interests for their own personal gain. Politicians often like to appeal to a certain class, the donor class, for example, and it can lead them to say one thing and do another. Anyway, so when you look at this political compass, you see that in theory there's this left libertarian viewpoint. Let's talk about libertarianism in the United States as I understand it. And I should say, I'm a working engineer as my day job. I don't actually read very much, although I listen to a lot of YouTube lectures, and that is my, means of learning. But I'm not a scholar. I want to kind of have a regular conversation, like the kinds of conversations that I have if I bump into people about these topics, because basically in the future on my channel I want to be able to talk about my style of communism, which is a libertarian communism, because I think it's maybe a good idea, a good way to organize production. And I want to be able to talk about the benefits of that mode of production without anybody thinking that I'm advocating for violence or force, because I absolutely oppose those things. I will, caveat that if there's a group of people who are subject to violence, they may need to use violence to respond. So that's another thing entirely. But as far as, visualizing the ideal future, I imagine a completely voluntary society, and I use the term communism, and I tend to stress it as libertarian communism. I use that term to describe a mode of production, which is a way of arranging the people and the resources in society in order to succeed at the process of production, of manufacturing goods. So libertarians in the United States, traditionally, there's like this old European term, libertarian, and that has a bit of socialist vibes to it, which I'll talk about the term socialism in a minute. But libertarians in the United States tend to be more, generally they are anti-state, so the state is like a formal term for the government. Certain thinkers will say that you can have a government that's not the state, and so this interesting definition is that it's hard to define what is the state. Well, the state is an institution which has a legal monopoly on the use of violence, and so the state can use violence against you if you've wronged the state. So I do not advocate for using any kind of state to achieve this mode of production, which I advocate for. I oppose the state generally as a concept, and so we have a state right now. So, for example, in the last election, I was really up for Bernie Sanders, because if we're going to have a state, then I'd rather, have one that uses money sensibly. And a lot of people don't seem, there's a popular political opinion that Bernie's politics were wasteful, but actually, based on my study of economics, they would have have a very strong positive impact on the lives of everyday Americans. I really think that what he said he would accomplish would have generally succeeded if he'd been elected to office and been able to enact these policies. His Green New Deal and Jobs program and Medicare for All are two programs which, I have caveats about all of this because I'd rather not use the state to do it. But if we are stuck with a state, we kind of have to make some decisions about how to operate it. I used to be, as I was learning about American libertarianism, I thought, well, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. And then I listened to speeches from Martin Luther King. He made this point that there are people starving right now, today, and there are government programs at the time which were paying people not to farm. And actually, I'm learning about farming, and I can understand why there is some reason why you might want to do that. They wanted the fields to recover. However, there were hungry people. And so if the government is going to pay people not to farm, it seems that it would make sense that they would compensate those who are hungry, that they can provide something, that they could have food programs.
We cry out against welfare handouts to the poor, but generously approve an oil depletion allowance to make the rich richer. 6 Mississippi plantations receive more than $1 million a year not to plant cotton, but no provision is made to feed the tenant farmer who is put out of work by the government subsidy. The crowning achievement in hypocrisy must go to those staunch Republicans and Democrats of the Midwest and West who were given land by our government when they came here as immigrants from Europe. They were given education through the land-grant colleges. They were provided with agricultural agents to keep them abreast of farming trends. They were granted low-interest loans to aid in the mechanization of their farms. And now that they have succeeded in becoming successful, they are paid not to farm. And these are the same people who now say to black people whose ancestors were brought to this country in chains and who were emancipated in 1863 without being given land to cultivate or bread to eat, that they must pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. What they truly advocate is socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor.
And actually, Martin Luther King generally tried to get independent organizations to provide for the people, but at times the government can be used. So anyway, using the government is kind of a fickle thing. It's tricky. It's very situational. When you have people who are experiencing trauma daily, you've got to put the fire out first, sometimes. But long-term, my vision is not to use the state. So what's interesting about my politics is that even though I identify as a libertarian communist, I've had conversations with more capitalist libertarians from the United States, and because everything I advocate for is voluntary, they're often extremely skeptical because of the terms that I'm using, but we tend to come to an understanding that we're talking about generally the same thing. But I have some different ideas about which mode of production would be preferable. So if you have a voluntary society, then people can form groups through free association. So if everybody's allowed to get together with others, they could advocate for something which they would then enact by their own hand. And to the extent that it doesn't, violate the will of others, that's fine. So for example, if a bunch of people, have access to a physical space and they want to build a library there, they can just go, buy books or, go through old collections and they can build a library. They don't need a government to do it, they can just do it. So this is called direct action. So an interesting thing about libertarianism in America is that they really advocate for the capitalist mode of production. But if you're a libertarian communist, it's not actually incompatible with their thinking. So I was recently listening to a talk from, I think it's the Heritage Foundation. I mean, this is a conservative organization, and among other things, they've funded climate change denial, for example. But I think it's really important to listen to opposing viewpoints and understand them, even if you have no intention of agreeing with it. If you don't understand what the other people around you are thinking and how they operate, then it will be very difficult for you to operate in a world where those people exist. Now, it can be dramatic and frustrating to listen to people spout, a bunch of nonsense. So, first of all, I tend to listen to the academics who are providing, more of a, a neutral, well, I don't want to say neutral, but, the political commentators pull up all this emotional stuff, and I find it really upsetting to listen to certain commentators. But the academic stuff is maybe less threatening to me. But I was going to say, I'm white and privileged, and so there's certain things that I can listen to that are not immediately threatening to me. If you listen to somebody and it's upsetting, then you don't have to listen to them, of course. But to the extent that it's, that you're able to, I really, really recommend this tactic. I call it sometimes opposition research. But that's almost more argumentative. I think actually I can find common ground with these people, and that they don't have to be opposition in the first place. But anyway, so this person from, I believe, the Heritage Foundation was talking about how, how do we, what is our duty to support others in society? And they referenced some old writers on the subject, but they also said, anyway, they supported the idea of mutual aid groups. Well, I mean, that's left anarchist stuff, is mutual aid groups, and the libertarians are fine with it because it's voluntary. If you want to pay money to a mutual aid group that's handing out food and blankets to those people that need it, that's perfectly compatible with libertarian thinking. And so it turns out that if you really want a voluntary society, then yes, a lot of the libertarians in America think that the capitalist mode of production is, the only way to go or something. And, you always have people who adhere to some political ideology who don't really have good principles. They don't have good praxis. They've, maybe just, they're young and they just heard about this thing, and so now they're just going to scream these principles down other people's throats. And it happens on every side, every area of the political landscape. You'll have people who just learned about something and they will naively shout the basics as if it's gospel. So I don't advocate for naive understanding of economics, and you just have to, go past those people. But when you go to people who are giving talks at foundations and stuff like this, they, and I've seen talks which are full of nonsense. I've watched some climate deniers, cite all of their information about, why we don't have to worry about fossil fuels, and it's just bunk. But it's very interesting to learn what lies are being told, especially when, you'll see somebody who goes on a news channel and they'll give a more palatable version of their talk, and then when you listen to them give an independent lecture at some private foundation, they'll just go wild sometimes, and you can really call out the people who are dishonest across the board when you find things like that. So anyway, so libertarians in America, they oppose the state, and so do anarchists. So now I got to talk about terms. So let's first talk about the term socialism. People in America have, and this was myself included until I learned about it, but we all were grown up with a really incorrect understanding of socialism. You can go read the Albert Einstein essay, Why Socialism, from the Socialist magazine, the Monthly Review. I'll put a link in the description. And it's just really great to see Albert Einstein talking about why we should have socialism. But what does that mean? So people in America tend to be familiar with Soviet socialism or communism, which in that term it was something where the state took over every industry. and then dictated to people how it needed to operate. So on the political compass, that's a very authoritarian kind of communism, as I said at the beginning of the video. But actually, the problem that people have with that was not the socialism. The real problem that people cite is the authoritarianism. The actual mode of production is still, in my opinion, a good idea. You just should not be forcing people to do it. So socialism, in my mind, it's if you allow that it can be anywhere on the spectrum, socialism is intentionally designing society to the benefit of, hopefully as many people as possible. And I generally think that it contrasts with individualism. So in a purely capitalist market-based society, it's kind of everyone for themselves, and it's just up to who buys what. And the problem is that because money is not evenly distributed, you have a very small number of people that have a lot of money, and then you have most people, 80% of the people have effectively no money compared to the top 20%. And you can cut that any way you want. I mean, compared to the top 2%, the rest of the people don't have a lot of money in comparison, at least per person. And depending on how you cut it, you get to the point where a small percentage of the people have more money than the whole, 80% of the people or something. And so it's non-democratic. And what that means is that the interests of the people with a lot of money are going to get serviced really well, but it might be to the detriment of the needs of the majority. And I'm not advocating for a majority rule, but again, in a completely voluntary society, it actually doesn't make sense for 80% of the people to be going about their day, going and doing all their work, waking up and taking the bus and doing all the stuff, and the stress of every day, doing all of that just so that some other people can have a good time. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. It would be better if the people could be working such that their work improves their own lives. So I view socialism as just, the term socialism is not the government does stuff, as Richard Wolff, mockingly characterizes that viewpoint. Socialism is not just the government does stuff. David Harvey, for example, is a Marxist scholar, and he says wealth redistribution is the lowest form of socialism. So if you're just going to tax the rich and give money to the poor or provide services or whatever, that is the lowest form of socialism. Okay? Well, what do I mean by that? I think I'm going to get to that in a minute, but I want to say, yeah, so that's the term socialism. So socialism is this huge umbrella term. It just means arranging society for the benefit of a large number of people. So that's how I use the term, and that is generally how socialists use the term. Something that's really important to understand is that all of the mass media in the United States, Fox, MSNBC, CNN, even NPR, all of this big media, it's like 99% bullshit. They're just full of it. They've got Ted Cruz calling Ted Cruz calling Joe Biden a communist, and it's like, nah, he ain't a communist. That's not what communism is. So you have politicians that just, everybody that comes out with a slightly populist position gets called a communist, and communism isn't just populism. So when you hear the media talking about things, I mean, you have to understand that if that's your primary diet of information, then you've been served a load of lies, unfortunately. It sells advertising space, but it's not informative. So you really have to look past that. So when I say what's real communism, you look back at the old writers who talked about it, the people who advocated for it. So Mikhail Bakunin, Peter Kropotkin, Errico Malatesta, listen to what they're talking about. So socialism is this broad term, I consider communism to be kind of a subset of socialism, where the idea is to arrange in groups and manage your production. So communism is a mode of production. Where socialism is like a kind of political thinking, like how are we going to imagine our politics? Okay, let's make sure we include everyone, and let's intentionally include everyone. So it's not just like, well, what do I need? I need a car, great, okay, let's make roads everywhere. It's like, well, some people would rather not have a car, so maybe we need trains and buses. So that style of thinking is kind of a political thinking that I call socialism. Communism is a mode of production, which is like, okay, you have people need to eat and people need material goods, so you've got to have factories that make stuff, and how do you arrange the management of these factories to achieve, suitable production? That's a mode of production. So capitalism is one mode of production, communism is another mode of production. So we're talking about terms. So socialism is a broad umbrella term. Capitalism, communism are modes of production. Let's talk about the term anarchism. So anarchism, the root words, it means no kings or no rulers. So it's also libertarian thinking. Again, it's a political philosophy, which is, let's imagine, how do we want to arrange people? And you could have rulers, or you could have a state government, which uses force to keep people in line. But anarchism is a completely voluntary society. So what's funny is that a lot of libertarians really don't like anarchists, but they use different terms to describe what is virtually the same thing. Again, you have certain people who claim to follow a certain political ideology, but they don't actually know what they're talking about. They just learned about it, or they're not really rigorous in their research, and so they might advocate for the wrong thing. But generally, anarchists want a voluntary society. Additionally, there's this concept of class in society. So we have like you have terms like high class, middle class, low class. And this tends to correlate to the wealth that people have. So high-class people, are like wealthy people. Middle-class people are, people who make above the median wage, but not super rich. And then you have, low-class or poor people just have less money. Sometimes it's used, class is used as a pejorative. But anyway, anarchists, in addition to wanting a society where all interactions are voluntary, they also want to try to arrange society so that it is a classless society. So right now we have the idea of high class, middle class, and low class, and it's just like, oh yeah, some people are rich, some people are poor. Some people have a 7,000 square foot home, and some people are living packed into a tiny room with dirt floors and can barely afford to eat. And people who like the idea of class, or nominally support it, just say, oh yeah, that's normal, that's natural. And anarchists don't think that that's natural, or the way that things need to be. And so they want to arrange a voluntary society where hierarchy, so class is a form of hierarchy. So and anarchists would say it is an unjust hierarchy. So Noam Chomsky will say that anarchism is the process of examining hierarchies in society and dismantling any hierarchies which cannot be justified. So Noam Chomsky says that, some force is occasionally justified. So if you're an adult and you're walking a child on the street and the child starts to run into the street, you grab their arm. You're going to use force to protect that child from oncoming traffic because the child is young and doesn't understand cars. So that is a justifiable form of force and hierarchy. So once examined, we can say that we do not need to dismantle, that kind of, parental oversight over children. But you could look at other hierarchies and you could question them. So Noam Chomsky will say that questioning those hierarchies is the process of anarchism. And anarchism is not, a specific form of society. It's more of a process of questioning hierarchy. Because humans who find themselves on the top of a hierarchy tend to like it, and so they want to use the power that they have from that hierarchy to perpetuate it, to keep it going. And so hierarchies can build and concentrate in human society, no matter what kind of society you have, no matter how you've arranged things. There's no way to guarantee that that won't happen, unless you just are the only person left alive. But as long as we have human society, then hierarchies will naturally develop, and we should, according to anarchism, continually question those hierarchies, and if there are any hierarchies that cannot be justified, we should dismantle them. But the first part of anarchism is a totally voluntary society, so a free society of free association. I can associate with whoever I want, and nobody can stop me. So that is just like libertarianism in the United States. Libertarianism in the United States, which again is distinct from European libertarianism. European libertarianism is just anarchism. So there's a history of libertarians in Europe, and those people are the anarchists and the socialists. So they want a free society, and they also want to, eliminate unnecessary hierarchies. In the United States, we're a very capitalist society, and so the people that started to adopt this term libertarianism, they're more capitalist focused, but they just don't want the state. And there are opportunist libertarians. So if you're really rich, then you just might not want the state because you don't want to pay taxes and you want to do whatever you want. I don't support that. Like, I don't support people who have a lot of power using their power against others for their own personal gain. Then there are people that just really like capitalism. Maybe it served them well. If you have a lot of privilege or you're lucky, which luck and privilege often go hand in hand, then you might just think, oh, capitalism worked great for me. I love it. Don't change anything. But that's, you're allowed to think that, but it's not going to work for everyone. And so, other people exist, and there's some, kind of natural reason why we need to collaborate with the other people around. I mean, we can't just go crashing through the world doing whatever the hell we want. There are questions about how to arrange people. Another term I want to talk about is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is something that came up in the 1970s and 1980s. Reagan and Margaret Thatcher introduced a kind of a free market politics into government. So instead of having, a bunch of government programs to help, people in need, instead, people in the government will say, we're going to use markets to do all this stuff. I haven't watched a lecture on neoliberalism recently, so I would suggest watching one by Ha-Joon Chang in the description below. He's a great economist, and he'll tell you all about neoliberalism and what it means. But a lot of the problems that people have with the government today in the United States and elsewhere are actually problems of neoliberalism. And some people think they are problems caused by the left, but actually the left and the right in the United States implement neoliberal policies. Okay, so we've talked about socialism. We've talked a little bit about communism. We'll go more into that. Anarchism. So anarchists, so the thing is that anarchists oppose hierarchy. And I did say that if you're the victim of violence, then you may need to use violence to, get yourself out of harm's way. If somebody's trying to force you down, you got to force them out. And because of that, anarchists will, have developed a variety of tactics in the past. There's a lot of, you could look at Spain in the 1920s was an interesting example of anarchism during the Spanish Civil War. So these people are fighting a war, and they have, occasionally done violent things. But anarchism, if you listen to Mikhail Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin, it's not a violent ideology. It's just that some people who, fly under that banner have used violence to oppose the state violence that they're, being subject to. So, you've had in popular media, anarchists are labeled as the people who are, causing whatever problem you can think of. But anarchism is actually very akin to libertarianism in the United States. It's about building a voluntary society. So, people might say, why don't you use different terms, though? Because, anarchism is already overloaded. People use that term for too much stuff. And, if you look back at what people were writing in the, late 1800s, early 1900s, these are the terms they used. And it would be confusing to try to make up new terms, and then you look back at what people are writing in the 1920s, and it might be harder to see the connection. So, I think it's important not to let people take over these terms and dilute them. The English language changes, but these words have important meaning, and I wouldn't want to get rid of that. So, it's interesting that so I haven't talked about Marxism, but I will. So the Marxist economist Richard Wolff had a debate with. So Wolff is basically a libertarian Marxist, and he doesn't use that terminology, but he's on the libertarian side. He's non-authoritarian. So Richard Wolff does not advocate that the U.S. federal government make Marxist policy. That's just not his move. I'll explain what he does advocate for in a moment, but Richard Wolff debated a libertarian recently at a Libertarian Institute, and it's on YouTube, so I'll put the link in the description. And basically the whole time the libertarian was like, oh yeah, I don't actually disagree with what you're saying. The whole time, what Richard Wolff was advocating for was Marxism as it relates to a mode of production. But politically, it was libertarianism. And so the libertarian was just like, oh yeah, I don't disagree with any of that stuff. It's just the whole time. It was really funny. And at the end, so what is Marxism? An important thing to understand about Karl Marx is that he wrote multiple books. And I guess everybody read the Communist Manifesto in school. I think I, skipped that homework or something like that. But it's really funny when Jordan Peterson has talked about Marx and Marxism for years and built a career talking about Marxism. And then when he went to debate Slavoj Zizek, Peterson said, I thought I would understand Marx, so I'm going to read the Communist Manifesto. Almost as if he hadn't read it before, which, I haven't either, but, Peterson is a scholar who talks all about Marx and Marxism, so that was a bit of a surprise. But actually, if you listen to Marxists like David Harvey, yeah, they don't talk about the Communist Manifesto. Marx wrote that when he was 30 or 32. It was it was a manifesto. It was here's some idea. Again, I haven't read it, but it was here's some ideas. Let's throw them all down. And then Marx spent the rest of his life writing a lot more books and fleshing all these ideas out. So anybody who's only read the Communist Manifesto and thinks they understand Marx, they don't. And like I said, I don't even think it's necessary to read it in order to understand Marx, because Marx's most significant work is Das Kapital. It was a critique of capitalism. So at the time that Marx had written this stuff, capitalism had been around 100 years or so. The Industrial Revolution was underway. People were working in factories, and Marx did a 3-volume work, a huge series of books on capitalism, and a huge analysis of it. And when people talk about Marxism, they are generally talking about that book, that series of books. Marx wrote other works as well. So it's really not about the Communist Manifesto, it's about Das Kapital. And so I'm going to call it Capital. So in Capital, Marx, I'm told, I've just followed, different people who have given summaries on this. So David Harvey teaches a class and does a close reading of Capital chapter by chapter. And because he's read it year in and year out, he can explain all the confusing pieces that you might not understand unless you read it multiple times, as he has. So, the basic overview of Marxism, I would say there's, a lot of pieces to it, but the most significant piece is a class analysis of the function of capitalism. So in a capitalist society, you have workers and you have business owners. And these people represent two different classes in society. So Marx called the workers the proletariat, and the owner class were the bourgeoisie. And Marx basically said that, so this is just like one way of looking at society. It's not like the only truth, there's a race, there's gender, there's all kinds of other ways of looking at the way that society is divided. We have different relationships based on location. So we have some people talk about the West versus East, or the global North, the global South. There's all kinds of ways of dividing up what's happening in the world and looking at it. But what Marx did was looked at the different lives of the owner class and the worker class. And basically, you have this situation where the workers are going to the factory day in and day out, and they get a wage. But the owners receive all the profits from the business. And the owners cannot receive the profits from the business without the workers. So the workers are, a necessary component of making this money. But basically, all the money goes to the owners, and then they pay some percentage, and if it's a profitable business, it's less than what the actual product is worth. So the workers might produce a whole bunch of valuable product and receive a small wage. So for example, if you're baking bread, you might have to bake 10 loaves of bread to earn enough wage to be able to buy a single loaf of bread. So the excess profit accrues to the owners of the businesses. And this leads to a situation where, across a society, you have most of the people are workers, and they're producing all the goods that are creating this profit. But because on paper somebody else owns that business, then that person receives actually all the profits from it. And the difference between the value of what the worker produces for the capitalist and the wage that they receive, the difference is called a surplus. And so the Marxist analysis of the capitalist mode of production, states basically that capitalists are taking the surplus from the workers. And so the general idea of Marxism, it's not about, I'm going to hold off on saying Marxism and just say that if you look at the analysis I just described, then, you can reasonably understand that, okay, if that's true, then the workers could, form like a union amongst all of themselves, and they could just fire the capitalists, and they could manage the business themselves, assuming that they could find a way to own the factory. Then the workers could manage themselves, and then all the profits that they created would go to them. So they would be the owners and the workers. If they could succeed in rearranging society so that the workers were also the owners, then whatever work they did, they would receive the fruits of their own labor. So that's the single biggest piece of Marxism that I find so interesting. And it's what Richard Wolff talks about a lot. So Marx wrote a lot of other things, and you'd have to listen to David Harvey to understand more of it. That's the essence of Marxism that I find so interesting. So this is also what Richard Wolff really talks about. Richard Wolff taking this insight, and Wolff is a great scholar. He's written a bunch of books, and he really understands this stuff. And so he, covered the whole landscape, learned about all of this, and came to the conclusion that, one simple change that we could make in America is we could have more cooperatives. So, that's the Marxist analysis of the capitalist mode of production. Says that, if the workers, if the business is owned by, a single owner or a board of directors, then all the profits that those workers create will go to the owner. So if the workers could be the owners, they would receive the profits, and so the workers would be wealthier. And there would also not be two classes. If the whole society was built on co-ops, then you wouldn't have ownership class and worker class. All the workers would be owners. No, there'd still be class differences that would crop up, but you'd eliminate this one significant one. So And so this is why when Richard Wolff and the Libertarian had a debate, the Libertarian actually didn't disagree with Wolff, because Wolff is just saying, I think it's a good idea for workers if workers form cooperatives instead of going to work for capitalists. And libertarians who love capitalism might not like the idea, but Wolff's proposal is entirely voluntary.
It is a pleasure to share a stage with Richard Wolff, who I consider my alter ego in a parallel universe. He wants the economy, as he explains in his book, Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. He wants the economy reorganized around workers' self-directed enterprises in which employees own and democratically run companies and keep the broadly defined profits or surplus that normally go to the employers. I fully support what Richard calls employees becoming their own employers, so long as people freely choose that arrangement. Richard thinks such firms are a substitute for capitalism, but they're actually just another option that capitalism offers. Nothing about the system of protecting property rights of firms in a free market dictates how these firms must be structured.
Now, he does from time to time suggest a means of using the government to make a little rule that says that if you have a business that meets a certain criteria and they want to sell the business, they first have to offer it to the workers, and the workers have a right of first refusal. So that's about the one time that Wolff will advocate for using the government for anything that's non-voluntary. But that's not really a critical part of his analysis, and you can take it or leave it. And so obviously that's a part where the libertarians will disagree, of course. But the general crux of his argument is, he's using his knowledge of Marx to say, well, it'd just be great if the workers owned the means of production. So that's how we get to libertarian communism. So communism is, again, a mode of production which says basically that we should get another idea is the concept of an institution. So businesses are institutions, and you might have nonprofits are institutions. A cooperative is an institution. A credit union is an institution. The government is an institution. And so generally in the United States, we think of the left and the right as the right wants more capitalism and more capitalist institutions, and the left wants more government and government institutional power. It's not actually true. The right advocates for certain government power, like power of war, and advocates for huge military budgets that are extremely wasteful and do not conserve money. And the left advocate often neoliberal policies where they actually want to use markets instead of the government. And so, when you really get into this stuff, everything is topsy-turvy. So if you have all these institutions, you could form a voluntary group of people that you could form a bunch of voluntary groups of people. So generally communism is like you have a bunch of businesses, and let's have every business as kind of its own commune. And then they all form a federated commune. And so they will, as a group, make a bunch of decisions as far as what they want to produce, and then the individual, factories will have their own union of workers, and who will then actually decide how to implement the decisions of the whole group. I'm gonna have to go into that, another time. But I guess what I want to establish is that libertarian communism is a thing, and it's compatible in many cases with American libertarianism. So if for the American libertarians who really care about a voluntary society, then it's actually, as long as it's voluntary, you don't have to use the capitalist mode of production. And it would be worth, if you're a libertarian capitalist, it would be worth learning about communism and understanding alternative modes of production. So, I would suggest learning from David Harvey about Karl Marx. Listen to Richard Wolff. He's an interesting guy. I guess the final thing I'll say is that maybe your life is fine maybe you live a life of privilege and you've got everything that you need, but most people don't. And libertarians will just say, oh, poverty is just a natural thing. But the mode of production that we use has a significant effect on poverty. And capitalism is a system that maintains poverty. Capitalism, capitalism is a system that does not inherently solve poverty. And in my mind, it makes sense to get together and come up with arrangements that we can agree on, which can help band people together and truly eliminate poverty. And that's why I'm a socialist, why I'm a communist, why I'm an anarchist. And as I've said in this video, I don't think that you should be afraid of those terms. All right, I think my brain is mush and I just can't think anymore. This was a long video and I'm sorry it's just kind of going on. I'm trying to figure out how to get my YouTube career going, and one of the easiest things for me to do is just to talk in front of the camera. And I understand that short videos that have all the points and bullets would be useful, so I'll have to keep thinking about how I can best work that into my schedule. I'm a working engineer, so it can be hard to find the time to sit down and do all of that writing and that work. But I think these ideas are really important, so I really want to communicate them. So I'll keep working on trying to make my content appealing. If you thought that this was all interesting and you're still here, then I would please ask that you subscribe to my YouTube channel. I have a website called reboot.love, which I sometimes add stuff to. I've got some kind of a history of some of my projects there. I'm also working on a farming robot that I think is really cool, so you could go to community.twistedfields.com and take a look at that. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully this was interesting to you. Please leave a comment and let me know what you thought about all of this. If you made it this far, I don't know, put a flower emoji in the comments. That'll be helpful for me. Yeah, all right, well, I guess that's enough for today. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.